False color. You've seen it before, and you've probably seen different examples of it well before you went down this rabbit hole of filmmaking. But now that you're in the rabbit hole of filmmaking, you should understand that your brain actually wants you to use false color to help you get your exposure right. Let me explain why. We're not very good at measuring light or color in discrete ways. Everything that we measure is actually relative. So you're familiar with the idea of rods and cones. Well, in our eyes, we have these cones that measure 3 different wavelengths of light: short wavelength, medium wavelength, and long wavelength. And so within our eyes, when these photoreceptors receive light, they measure the intensity compared to each of the other cones for our brain to be able to actually interpret light. But what's interesting is if we only have information going into one of these cones, we can't actually determine color. Our brain is needing the comparison between other cones for us to be able to interpret color. Because our perception of color is relative, we can mess with it. So check this out. So this is a black and white image. It's really quite simple, and if I put a false color on here and have you stare at the center for a few seconds, what you'll see is we're gonna flip back to the black and white picture, and you're gonna see it in full color because of our ability to change the relative perception of color. See, check this out. So you can see our brains can get messed with quite easily when it comes to color, and the same thing happens with brightness. So if we have something that's dark and it's surrounded by something bright, it's gonna look darker. But if you have that same dark thing and you put it in a much darker image, it's going to appear brighter. So what is false color? Well, it's simply a technique to easily help us distinguish particular features in an image. So if we're talking predator vision, it's all about finding Arnold. In the case of filmmaking, we're using false color to help us distinguish between varying levels of brightness. So, for instance, is it easy to tell if my skin tone is at about 65 IRE right now? How about in this one? But you can see if we flip on the false color, it's pretty easy to tell that my skin tone is in fact sitting right at 65 IRE in both of these images. If I'm exposing in different environments, it may be a lot more challenging than I expect to be able to get my skin tone exactly where I want. But with false color on, it's a lot easier to distinguish if I'm right where I want to be. So how do we actually use it to help us get our exposure right? The way that it works is we actually take one particular image variable, in this case, the brightness of the image, and create a grayscale with that brightness. Once we've created the grayscale, then we can attribute whatever color we want to specific areas within that grayscale. So commonly you'll see things like skin tone being marked, the clipping point of white, the clipping point of black, 18% gray, 40% gray, different areas that you want to demarcate to help you in identifying specific exposure areas and relative brightness. Here's how I set up my false color. For log picture profiles, which we're actually squeezing in extra dynamic range, so we're shrinking our black point and our white point towards the center, what I'll do is I'll set up a reference marker at my black point, and the black point being what it will be once I convert it to Rec. 709. And I'll also set up a color at my white point, again, what it's going to be in Rec. 709. And then I'll add a gradation between that and 0 IRE and that and 100% IRE to help me know where the extra data I'm getting is. So in the case of S-Log3, which I use quite frequently, I'm going to set that black point at 10 IRE. And then I'm going to set my white point at 93 IRE. And then the other thing that I'll add is my skin tone lines. For me, I like my skin tones to be between 65 and 75 IRE in S-Log3. And so I'll set 2 different brackets there just to help me know when I'm in that range. And then with log, one other thing that I'll add is middle gray, which is 18% gray. And in S-Log3, that's at 41 IRE. So I'll add that just so I know where middle gray should be sitting when I'm exposing. And then for Rec 709 profiles, I'll actually just set up my black and white point. So basically between 0 and 5 IRE and 95 and 100 IRE. So I know if I'm getting towards the real black point or the real white point. And then I'll also add my skin tone lines. And in this case, I like my skin tone to be about 55 to 65 IRE. I'll set 2 bands there that help me to know when I'm hitting that skin tone. Now, a big caveat, your skin tones don't need to be perfectly recorded in 65 to 75 IRE range. Obviously, depending on the mood you're trying to film, you might want to make adjustments. But for me, it's helpful to have that range of where I typically like to see them sit. So when it comes time to shoot, I will actually try to set up my camera without using false color, get things where I think they look good, and then switch over to false color to help myself check and see. What am I clipping out of my shot? Do my skin tones look good? And am I happy overall with the image? And then I'd make minor tweaks or adjustments to help me dial in either my lighting or my exposure. False color is a helpful tool. I wouldn't use it for absolutely everything, and it's definitely not something that's on my monitor 100% of the time, but it is something that does help me understand how my exposure looks, how my lighting looks, and it prevents me from relying on my brain's ability to relatively compare brightness and color, and rather just have a clean, easy way of understanding my exposure levels. I hope you found this information helpful, and I hope you like the long form sort of scientific approach that I'm trying to take. I find it quite interesting, but I want to hear if you do too. So like and subscribe, leave a comment below if you do like this format. Thanks for watching.